Hello everyone. It's a pleasure to present today about Sabaki and the sea, and I'm sorry not to be there in person. I'll post a copy of my slides and notes to my page at academia.edu, so you can catch up with anything you miss there. Now here's a quick visual reminder of where we're coming from. My favoured scenario is that northeast coast Bantu spread in that general direction along the curving line of the Eastern Arc Mountains, while moving eastwards down to the Indian Ocean and then northwards up the coast. There's a relatively narrow gap in the far northeast of Tanzania between the Eastern Usambara Mountains and the coast, and it looks that's the way they and their language went. On this interpretation, the Sabaki are the subgroup that moved north into what is now Kenya before branching in different directions. The diagram shows one possible genetic tree of Sabaki. Note that Mijikenda, Lower Pokomo and Comorian are characterized as a late innovating group. And language, geography and classification suggest that firstly, northeast coast Bantu speakers in what is now Tanzania probably reached the Indian Ocean first, and secondly that Sabaki speakers were close to the Indian Ocean very early in their history. However, only two extant branches have strongly developed maritime cultures, Swahili and Comorian. One reading of a much disputed passage in the Periplus suggests that Bantu-speaking farmers were already settled near the Tanzanian coast by the middle of the 1st century AD. At the same time, there is no indication that the island dwellers to their north were farmers. They were only described as fishers and turtle catchers. Archaeological evidence for that earlier period is inconclusive, but becomes much firmer in the following centuries. This slide shows conventional correlations between different ceramic traditions and past language communities, though archaeologists now caution against oversimplifying such equations. There's more detail on the chronologies of Swahili and Comorian expansion on this slide. The dates are conservative and based partly on recent recalibrations and quality assessments. I've used by dates that indicate reasonable confidence in the evidence rather than possible initial settlement. Note the progression of dates, their presumed correlations, and the transition implied in the evidence from the Mafia archipelago, where we have both earlier traditions and then a break and evidence of something else starting up by 700 in the Common Era. A note of caution should be added from the ethnographic evidence. Living near the sea does not necessarily entail reliance upon marine resources. There are many Bantu-speaking farmers and others in this region whose practice demonstrates this, Swahili and Comorian speakers included. I've already discussed some of the lexical evidence for Swahili in earlier publications and presentations. I'd revise some specific etymological proposals now, but my general conclusions remain the same. I'll focus today on marine fauna, not least because it provides large numbers of lexical items to analyse. That said, I'll only look in detail at an indicative few. The generic name for emperors is one of many that shows regular reflexes across the Swahili spectrum. It probably originally described their aggregating behaviour. Another readily reconstructable name is the common term for groupers, which probably originally referred to their characteristic motion or behaviour, hence floaters. Here are more Proto-Swahili reconstructions of names of marine creatures based on their appearance or behaviour. Some, like the common name for parrotfishes, appear to reflect close observation. That's Pono in the third line. A significant subset were semantic extensions of the names of familiar terrestrial animals, a process that remained productive as Swahili diversified and different subtaxa were distinguished. And so you have names like Pungu, after the bird of prey, flying fishes named after grasshoppers, and there are many other examples of that kind. It's also possible to reconstruct Proto-Comorian names that have different roots from their Swahili equivalents, though the quality of available data and small number of close dialects make this trickier. I've shown a particularly significant example here, the convict surgeonfish, a species associated locally with an unpleasant odour. It appears to have been named after a terrestrial animal with similar associations, the bush hyrax. These are not found in the Comoro Islands, and the name used is probably originally from a Suta language. And here's a small sample of more Comorian innovations, including another, Itrili, which may be based on a loanword, may also be based on a loanword from a Suta language. That's in the third line there. Given that we can reconstruct different names to both Proto-Swahili and Proto-Comorian, then can we reconstruct others to Proto-Sabaki? Nurse and Hinnebush provide just one reconstructed fish name that they don't characterise as doubtful, and that's the generic term for sharks. But for different reasons I'd put a question mark before this, not least because dried shark meat is widely traded in the hinterland of the coast, and may have been for a long time. And on this slide, in small letters below, I've added a selection of other terms that look as though they might be reconstructible, some supplied by Nurse and Hinnebush, others by me. And I think all of these can be rejected as secure Proto-Sabaki reconstructions. Some of the reasons for this were given by Nurse and Hinnebush themselves when spelling out their criteria for reconstructing Proto-Swahili. Proto-Sabaki. Even if comparisons between Comorian and the two branches of Swahili are admitted, regular correspondences do not necessarily distinguish inheritance from early borrowing. A putative Proto-Sabaki form may be formally indistinguishable from an early Swahili loan of the same shape. Indeed, many Proto-Sabaki, Proto-Swahili and Proto-Southern Swahili reconstructions are themselves identical. However, Nurse and Hinnebush did demonstrate successive northern and southern Swahili influence on Proto-Comorian, and lexical evidence of this can be seen in marine vocabulary. This slide shows the borrowed name for rabbit fishes. Note that Maore and Sasi has a mixed shape, that may reflect reinterpretation or perhaps an earlier stage in the development of the northern Swahili form. Some loanwords from northern Swahili may be buried in the doubtful list of indeterminate etymologies, but others may be from southern Swahili, which seems to have provided a larger number of loanwords and to have continued doing so. Here's one example. Comorian appears first to have developed its own term for groupers, shown at the top right of the slide, perhaps by metathesis of a Proto-Swahili or early Southern Swahili form. It later borrowed other Southern Swahili forms, probably in more than one phase, and such layering can make sources and relative chronologies difficult to disentangle, especially where analogical levelling may also be involved. The Southern Swahili dialects in turn borrowed marine vocabulary from Comorian. This included outrigger terminology as well as fish names. Another grouper name in Comorian means simply red fish and refers primarily to hinds, though it is also extended to other species. This appears to have been borrowed into Southern Swahili, whose speakers have not recognised the Comorian classifier, the fish at the beginning, and its origin as a compound term. It also seems to have been remodelled when extended to red snappers, perhaps under the influence of a widespread term for trigger fishes, which is shown in a sort of a more yellowy colour on the slide. Lexical exchanges of this kind give us a sense of relative dating. There are also more specific clues. An old Comorian term for tiger sharks and other large shark species means simply lizardback, though it was reanalyzed in Maori to mean rough skinback. As I've argued elsewhere, the Comorian terms for lizard appear to have been borrowed from Swahili and can be traced back to Arabic and the Islamic concept of impurity. Loanwords like this, the term for a mosque is another, can't be dated absolutely, but they can be added to and compared with the dates and date ranges provided by documentary sources and archaeology. Some of these may seem frustratingly vague, but I think our relative chronologies are nonetheless becoming progressively better constrained. So, to sum up, here are my current working hypotheses. I began by thinking that marine vocabulary might be securely reconstructible to Proto-Sabaki, but have yet to find any terms that are. Instead, a more nuanced picture is emerging, in which extensive exploitation of marine resources and maritimity maritimity more generally, developed more than once in Sabaki, at different times and in different language communities, whose speakers learned from one another as well as from speakers of other languages in the wider region. And I'll just run through very quickly the working hypotheses on the slide, and these are based upon different sources. And of course they're not set in stone. So northeast coast Bantu speakers had probably reached the Indian Ocean coast by the first centuries in the Common Era, perhaps before the Periplus. And Sabaki speakers had moved into southeast Kenya by around 300, perhaps earlier. A distinct Swahili speech community and maritime culture had emerged by around 500, largely through local adaptation and lexical innovation. And marine species names often reflect close observation of appearance and behaviour, including comparison with familiar terrestrial fauna. And by around 600 in the Common Era, northern Swahili had spread to the Lamu archipelago and southern Swahili to Zanzibar. By around 700, the latter, southern Swahili, had reached south-central Mozambique. And Proto-Comorian had emerged as a distinct speech community in southeast Kenya by around 600, developing its own maritime culture and lexicon. It interacted with both northern and southern Swahili before northern Swahili moved northwards. And lexical exchange was asymmetrical, mainly from southern Swahili into Proto-Comorian, but with some transfer in the other direction. Suta also contributed vocabulary, the Suta languages. Early Malagasy contact brought further specialised vocabulary, while Malagasy also absorbed Proto-Comorian marine and other lexis. And by around 800, Proto-Comorian speakers were established in the Comoros themselves, where contacts with Swahili and Malagasy continued. An exposure to Islam and Islamic vocabulary may have begun before migration, that is, migration to the Comoros. Widespread conversion and stronger Islamic influence came later as Proto-Comorian differentiated into island varieties. There is, of course, a need to refine and test the hypotheses that I've outlined. And let me leave you with a few further questions to add to the mix. So here they are, now you can see them on the slide. Beginning with, is there evidence outside Sabaki for early marine adaptation among Tanzanian northeast coast Bantu and neighbouring groups? I haven't found anything that's really convincing so far, just some sort of hints. Is there evidence inside Sabaki for early marine adaptation other than in Swahili and Comorian? Again, I haven't found any really convincing evidence. What can be recovered of the maritime cultures of pre-Bantu coastal fishers and foragers? So far, not very much, if anything. And what exactly was the relationship between Proto-Comorian and the Suta languages? And that's a very interesting question. And can the mainland locations of Proto-Swahili and Proto-Comorian be narrowed down further? I think that they can, and I could take a stab at it myself. And can linguistic chronologies be correlated with archaeological and historical dates? That's obviously a big one. Did Malagasy interact directly with other Sabaki languages as well as Proto-Comorian? And if so, where? The connection with Comorian is clear. With Swahili and other languages, it may have been indirect, and only indirect, but that remains to be demonstrated. And did these exchanges involve particular early Malagasy varieties? As they developed. And had Proto-Comorian begun to diverge dialectally before migration to the Comoros? And what more can early Islamic vocabulary tell us about the chronology and geography of contact? Of course, it's difficult to tease out early loanwords from later ones and words that have been borrowed and reborrowed again at different times. Can we reconstruct more of the early interactions between Swahili and Comorian dialects? And what role did specialist fishing communities and long-range fishing play in lexical diffusion? This is a kind of very specialised types of fishing where people go on long seasonal trips and camp on distant islands and coasts to fish in other waters. And how securely can we distinguish between inheritance, borrowing, and parallel innovation? Obviously, again, an important question that we've only just touched on. And with that, let me say shukrani, marhaba in Comorian, I believe, and thank you very much.